Avery Quinn pedaled her bike through the crowded streets of New York, her breath fogging in the chilly morning air. At 25, she was just another face in the city, a delivery girl weaving between honking taxis and hurried pedestrians. Her life was simple, built on small dreams and smaller paychecks. Every dollar she earned went into a jar labeled hope, a fund she kept for kids in need. Kids like she once was. She didn't have much, but she had enough to believe the world could be kinder if she tried. It was raining that day, a gray drizzle that blurred the skyscrapers into smudges of steel and glass. Avery was late, her tires slipping on wet pavement as she rushed to deliver a package. She didn't see the sleek black car until it was too late. The screech of brakes filled the air, and her bike crashed into its side, leaving a dent that screamed money she didn't have. Heart pounding, she scrambled to her feet, ready to apologize, when the driver's door opened. James Sullivan stepped out, tall and sharp in a tailored suit, his dark hair damp from the rain. He was the kind of man who owned rooms before he even entered them. The CEO of Sullivan Enterprises, a name whispered in boardrooms across the country. Avery braced herself for anger, for a lecture about carelessness, but James just looked at her. His eyes, a deep hazel, held something she couldn't place, something soft beneath the polished exterior. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady, almost gentle. She nodded, brushing mud off her jacket, her cheeks burning under his gaze. "The car," she stammered. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for it somehow." James glanced at the dent, then back at her. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "It's $2 million, he said, casual as if discussing the weather. Avery's stomach dropped. $2 million. She couldn't imagine that kind of money, let alone owe it. Then he said something that stopped her cold. "Marry me for a year, and I'll forgive the damage. I'll even give you $5 million on top of it." The words hung between them, absurd and impossible. Avery stared at him, rain dripping from her hood, wondering if he was serious. He was. She could see it in the way he stood, confident, waiting for her answer, like it was a business deal. "But she wasn't for sale. I'd rather owe you forever than sell my heart," she said, her voice firm despite the tremble in her hands. James tilted his head, surprised, maybe even impressed. Inside, Avery's mind spun. She thought to herself, "I've seen men like him before, rich, charming, untouchable. They take what they want and leave the rest behind. But something in his eyes felt different, like he was searching for something I didn't even know I had. It scared me, how much I wanted to believe him." She handed him a crumpled IOU scribbled on a napkin, promising to pay for the car bit by bit. "I'm Avery Quinn," she said, "and I keep my word." He took the napkin, his fingers brushing hers for a split second, and introduced himself. "James Sullivan, COO of Sullivan Enterprises, $50 billion in assets. Not bad, right?" Avery almost laughed. Not bad? It was a universe away from her life, her $20 in savings, her beat-up bike. "Avery Quinn," she replied. "Full-time rider, $20 to my name, but I'll pay you back." James pocketed the IOU, his smile growing. "No need to pay," he said, "but I have one condition." She tensed, waiting. "I want you," he said simply. "Not her money, not her apology, just her." Avery stepped back, shaking her head. "It was just a dent. Why are you making this so hard?" she asked. He didn't push, just watched her go as she pedaled away, rain soaking through her clothes. That night, alone in her tiny apartment, Avery replayed the moment. James Sullivan wasn't just a man with a fancy car. He was a mystery, a pull she couldn't explain, and somewhere deep down, she wondered if fate had just knocked on her door. Avery Quinn didn't always ride a bike through New York's chaos. Once she had a different life, one tangled in love and promises she thought would last forever. 3 years ago, she married Tyler Reed, a man with a crooked smile and a heart she trusted too much. She met him at 22, still carrying the weight of a childhood accident that nearly took her life. At 12, she'd been hit by a car, saved by a stranger who gave her blood and a lollipop. a small kindness she never forgot. Tyler claimed he was that stranger, and Avery believed him. It was the start of everything, and the beginning of her unraveling. Tyler wasn't rich when they met. He was a dreamer, full of big ideas and empty pockets. Avery loved him for it, saw herself in his hunger to be more. She worked double shifts, delivering packages late into the night, pouring every cent into his startup. She didn't mind the exhaustion, the way her hands ached from gripping handlebars. "He's building something," she'd tell herself, "and I'm part of it." Tyler promised her the world, whispered it in the dark of their cramped apartment. "You and me, Avery, will rise together." She believed him, stitched his broken plans together with her quiet faith. But the world Tyler built wasn't for her. As his company grew, so did the distance between them. He stopped looking at her the way he used to, stopped seeing her at all. Then came Ava Bennett, a woman with sharp heels and sharper ambition, dripping in wealth. Tyler couldn't resist. Avery caught them together one night, Ava's laughter echoing through the office. Avery had helped pay for. Tyler didn't even flinch. "You're holding me back," he said, his voice cold. "Ava's the future. You're just a delivery girl." The words cut deeper than any crash ever could. Margaret, Tyler's mother, made it worse. She'd never liked Avery, never thought her good enough for her precious son. After the breakup, Margaret cornered her outside their old apartment. "You'll never be enough," she sneered, her eyes gleaming with spite. "A girl like you belongs on the street, not in our family." Avery stood there, rain soaking her jacket, feeling the weight of every sacrifice she'd made. Inside, she screamed, "I gave him everything. My trust, my dreams, my quiet nights stitching his broken plans together, and he threw it away like it was nothing." But outside, she stayed silent, walking away with her head high. The divorce left her with nothing but her bike and that jar labeled hope. Tyler took the company, the money, the life they'd built. Avery didn't fight it. She told herself she didn't need him, didn't need anyone. She'd survived worse. But the betrayal lingered, a bruise on her heart she couldn't shake. She threw herself into work, pedaling harder, delivering faster, trying to outrun the ache. New York became her refuge, its noise drowning out the echoes of Tyler's lies. Then James Sullivan walked back into her life. It was a week after the car crash, outside a diner where she'd just dropped off an order. Tyler was there too, arm around Ava, flaunting his new success. Margaret trailed behind, her voice loud as she bragged. "My son's a genius, and Ava's the perfect match. Not some nobody who can't even afford a decent coat." Avery clenched her fists, ready to turn away when James appeared. He'd been watching from across the street, his car parked nearby. He stepped forward, calm but unyielding, and faced Tyler. "She's worth more than you'll ever understand," James said, his voice cutting through the chatter. Tyler laughed, Ava smirked, but James didn't back down. He looked at Avery, his hazel eyes steady, and for the first time in months, she felt seen. Not as a failure, not as a shadow, but as herself. Margaret huffed. "Who are you to talk? She's nothing." James didn't answer her. He just turned to Avery and said, "You don't have to listen to this. Let me get you out of here." She hesitated, then nodded, following him to his car. As they drove through the city, James didn't ask questions, didn't push. He just let her sit there, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Avery stared out the window, her thoughts a tangled mess. Why is he doing this? She wondered. I'm nobody to him, just a girl who dented his car. But the way he stood up for me, it felt like he saw something I've forgotten. She stole a glance at him, his profile sharp against the city lights. He caught her looking and smiled, soft and real. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, even though she wasn't sure. That night, alone again, Avery sat on her bed, the IOUs she'd given James still on her mind. She didn't know why he kept showing up, why he cared. Inside, James was wrestling with his own thoughts. He'd built an empire, surrounded himself with power and wealth, but none of it felt real anymore. I've got everything, he thought, but watching her stand there, unbroken despite everything, I felt like the poorest man alive, because I didn't have her. He didn't know her past, didn't know the scars she carried, but he knew one thing. Avery Quinn was different, and he couldn't let her slip away. Avery Quinn carried more than a delivery bag on her shoulders. Beneath her worn jacket and quiet demeanor lay a secret so big it could shake New York's towering skyline. 10 years ago, she wasn't just a girl on a bike. She was the eldest daughter of the Harper family, a dynasty that ruled Wall Street with an iron grip. But that life ended when her younger sister, Isabel Harper, turned against her. Isabel, jealous and cunning, framed Avery for a scandal that never happened, whispering lies to their father until he cast her out. At 15, Avery was left with nothing but a name she couldn't claim and a heart full of silent fury. She didn't break, she built. Over a decade, Avery clawed her way up, creating Apex Consortium, a financial empire that dwarfed even the Harper legacy. She hid her identity, worked in the shadows, became a ghost in the world of wealth she once knew. By day, she delivered packages, blending into the city's pulse. By night, she pulled strings that made billionaires tremble. Apex wasn't just a company, it was her revenge, her redemption. Every brick laid with the tears she'd shed. They thought they shattered me when they cast me out, she thought. But every tear I shed built this empire. Now they'll kneel, not because I demand it, but because they've lost everything. The past came knocking one crisp autumn evening. Avery was outside a coffee shop counting her tips when Isabel appeared. Her sister hadn't changed. Same haughty tilt of the chin, same venom in her smile. With her was Lucas Grayson, heir to the Grayson fortune, a man whose arrogance matched Isabel's ambition. They spotted Avery, and Isabel laughed, loud and sharp. "Still peddling for pennies, I see," she said. "You're a disgrace to the Harper name." Lucas joined in, his voice dripping with scorn. "Kneel and apologize for breathing our air. Maybe we'll let you keep your little job." Avery stood still, her hands steady despite the storm inside. She could feel the weight of a decade pressing down, the years of being invisible while they lived off her stolen legacy. "I don't kneel," she said, her voice low but firm. Isabel smirked, stepping closer. "You will. You're nothing now." That's when James Sullivan arrived. He'd been nearby meeting a client and saw the confrontation unfold. He walked over, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. "Back off," he told them, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lucas sneered. "Who are you to interfere?" James didn't flinch. "Someone who knows she's more than you'll ever be." The standoff drew a crowd, whispers rippling through the onlookers. Isabel, furious, doubled down. "She's a nobody, a failure. She doesn't belong here." Avery met her sister's gaze, then made a decision. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and spoke quietly. Minutes later, the news hit. Harper's stocks plummeted, a free fall triggered by a single move. Avery had dumped $10 million into a calculated strike, wiping out a third of their value. Isabel's face went pale, Lucas stammered, but Avery just watched, calm as the chaos unfolded. "You wanted me to kneel," she said, "but I think you're the ones who should start practicing." James stood by her, stunned but steady. Later, in his car, he asked, "What was that?" Avery shrugged, a faint smile on her lips. "Just settling a score." He didn't push, but his mind raced. She's not just a delivery girl, he thought. There's power in her, raw and real. I've built my own world, but hers feels bigger, deeper, and I'm drawn to it, to her like nothing else. That night, Avery faced a bigger test. Apex Consortium hosted a secret gala, and she attended as the Apex Queen, her identity masked. She approached James, testing him. "Marry me," she said, her voice disguised. "I'll give you everything, wealth, power, a future beyond your dreams." James looked into her eyes, not knowing it was Avery behind the mask. He shook his head. "I don't care who you are to the world," he said. "To me, you're not her. There's only one person who makes my heart stop, and she's not here." Avery's breath caught. She'd spent years hiding, building walls. But James saw through them without even knowing it. "He doesn't want the queen," she thought, stepping away. "What's me? The real me. The girl I buried long ago. How can he do that? How can he see what I've forgotten? Back in her apartment, Avery sat alone, the city lights flickering outside. She held a lollipop, a keepsake from that childhood accident, rolling it between her fingers. "I've fought so hard to be strong," she mused, "to prove I don't need anyone. But James, he's different. He doesn't care about my power, my money. He just cares about me. And that scares me more than any enemy ever could." She didn't know it yet, but James was wrestling with the same pull. In his penthouse, he stared at the IOU she'd given him, its edges worn from being carried too long. "She's a mystery," he thought, "and I'd give up everything to solve it. Not for her secrets, but for her heart." The lines between them were blurring, drawn tighter by fate they couldn't yet see. Avery wasn't just a delivery girl, and James wasn't just a CEO. They were something more, something waiting to be uncovered. Avery Quinn stood on the edge of something she couldn't name, her heart a tangle of hope and fear. James Sullivan had become more than a chance encounter, more than a man who stepped into her life when she least expected it. He was a mirror, reflecting pieces of herself she'd buried long ago. But there was a story he carried, one he didn't know connected them, a thread from the past pulling them closer with every breath. It started one quiet evening, weeks after the confrontation with Isabel and Lucas. James invited Avery to his penthouse, not for business or grand gestures, but for something simple, coffee and conversation. The city glittered below, a sea of light stretching to the horizon. They sat on his balcony, the air cool, and James's voice grew soft as he spoke. "I've never told anyone this," he said, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "When I was 12, I was in a car accident, a bad one. I would have died if a girl hadn't saved me. She gave me her blood, kept me alive until help came. And before she left, she handed me a lollipop and said, 'I'll wait for you.' I've been looking for her ever since." Avery froze, the world tilting beneath her. She remembered that day, the rain, the crumpled car, the boy she'd pulled from the wreckage. She'd been 12 too, fearless in a way only a child could be. She'd given him her blood, her lollipop, a promise she didn't understand until now. 15 years, James continued, his eyes distant. "I searched everywhere, asked everyone. The last I heard, she'd died. But I never stopped hoping." He pulled a faded wrapper from his pocket. The lollipop's paper, creased and worn. Avery's chest tightened. She had the same one, tucked away in a box she rarely opened. Inside, her thoughts collided. "It's him," she realized. "The boy I saved, the one I promised to wait for. But what if he only loves the memory of that girl, not the woman I am now? I'm not that brave kid anymore. I'm scarred, guarded, a mess of secrets and survival." She stayed silent, afraid to break the moment, afraid to lose him to a ghost. James looked at her, his gaze searching. "You remind me of her," he said. "Not just because you're strong, but because you make me feel safe, like I found something I didn't know I was missing." Days passed, and Avery wrestled with the truth. She wanted to tell him, to spill everything, but doubt held her back. "He sees me," she thought, "but does he see all of me, the girl who loved too hard, who lost too much?" Meanwhile, the Apex banquet loomed, a night where New York's elite would gather under her command. Isabel and Lucas had other plans. They dug into James' company, threatened his stocks, tried to force him to abandon Avery. "Leave her," Lucas sneered at a meeting James attended. "She's a liability. We'll ruin you if you don't." Isabel chimed in, "She's nothing, James. You deserve better." James didn't hesitate. He stood, his voice steady. "I'd give up everything, my name, my wealth, my future, just to hold her hand. You don't get it. She's not a liability. She's my reason." Avery wasn't there, but word reached her, carried by whispers through the city. Her heart ached with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "He's fighting for me," she thought. "Not for power, not for pride, but for me. How do I deserve that?" She knew the banquet would be the turning point, the moment she'd have to face him as she truly was. The night arrived, grand and glittering, held in a ballroom overlooking Central Park. Avery entered as the apex queen, her face half hidden by a silver mask, her dress a cascade of midnight blue. She moved through the crowd, commanding every eye until she found James. He stood alone, watching, unaware of who she was. She approached, her voice altered by the mask's echo. "Marry me," she said, "and I'll give you the world." James looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. "I don't want the world," he said. "I want her, Avery. She's the only one who matters." Avery's mask slipped. Not physically, but in her heart. She stepped back, her breath shallow. "He doesn't know it's me," she thought, "and still he chooses me. Not the queen, not the power, just me." The room buzzed. Isabel and Lucas closing in, their plan unfolding. They'd spread rumors, turned allies against James, threatened to bankrupt him unless he left her. Lucas grabbed his arm. "Walk away now, or you're finished." James pulled free, his voice rising. "Finish me then. I'm not leaving her, ever." That was it. Avery couldn't hide anymore. She tore off the mask, letting it clatter to the floor, her face bare for all to see. The crowd gasped. Isabel paled. Lucas froze. Avery walked to James, her steps steady, and held up her hand. The apex ring gleamed, a symbol of her power, but it wasn't what she wanted him to see. She pulled the lollipop from her pocket, the twin to his wrapper, and placed it in his palm. "I'm the girl from that rainy day, James," she said, her voice breaking, "and I've loved you longer than you'll ever know." James stared at the lollipop, then at her, his eyes wide with recognition. "Avery," he whispered, pulling her close, his arms wrapped around her, strong and sure, and she felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I spent years chasing a shadow," he said against her hair, "but you were right here, my light, my home, my everything." The room faded, the threats, the power, all of it meaningless. They stood there, locked in each other, two souls finding their way back after too long apart. Avery's mind raced as she clung to him. "I thought I'd lost this," she thought. "The chance to be loved for who I am, not what I've built. He's my past, my present, my forever. How did I get so lucky?" James pulled back, just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. "I've been searching for you," he said, "and I'll never let you go again." She smiled, a real one, the kind she'd forgotten she could feel. "You don't have to," she replied. "I'm here. I've always been here." The banquet dissolved into chaos, Isabel and Lucas shouting, demanding answers, but Avery and James didn't hear them. They were lost in their own world, a promise kept after 15 years. "Fate," James murmured, brushing a tear from her cheek. "It's fate." Avery nodded, her heart full. "Fate," she echoed, and for the first time she believed it. Avery Quinn and James Sullivan stood together in the aftermath of the Apex banquet, the world around them buzzing with shock and whispers. But none of it mattered. They'd found each other, not just as lovers, but as pieces of a puzzle separated too long. The next morning, they didn't rush to a grand wedding or a public declaration. Instead, they chose something quieter, something theirs. In a small New York chapel, with only a priest and the lollipop they'd both kept as witnesses, they said their vows. "I promise to hold you through every storm," James said, his voice thick with emotion. Avery smiled, her eyes shining. "And I promise to be your home, always." The city kept spinning, but for them time slowed. Isabel Harper appeared one last time, her face drawn with desperation. She'd lost everything. Her family's fortune crumbled under Avery's quiet wrath. "Please," Isabel begged, dropping to her knees outside Avery's apartment. "I know I was wrong. Don't hold it against me. Forgive me." Avery looked at her, the sister who'd stolen her past, and felt a flicker of pity, but forgiveness wasn't hers to give anymore. "You took my family," she said, her voice steady, "but you gave me a reason to find myself. That's enough. Now go." Isabel slunk away, a shadow of the girl she'd been. Tyler Reed and his mother, Margaret, faced their own ruin. The company Avery had built for Tyler collapsed without her unseen support. and Ava Bennett vanished as quickly as she'd come, chasing the next shiny prize. Margaret wailed outside their old office. "It's all her fault, that delivery girl." But Tyler just sat, silent, staring at the wreckage of his greed. Avery didn't gloat. She didn't need to. They made their choices, she thought, and I've made mine. I don't carry their weight anymore. James had choices too. His family, the Sullivans, demanded he return, reclaim his place as heir. "You're throwing away your legacy for her," his father shouted, voice echoing through their mansion. James didn't argue. He packed a single bag and walked out, leaving behind the wealth, the name, everything but the man he wanted to be. "I don't need it," he told Avery later, sitting on her tiny couch. "I've got you. That's more than enough." She laughed, soft and real. "You're crazy, you know that?" He grinned. "Crazy for you." They found a small house on the edge of the city, a place with creaky floors and a garden just big enough for dreams. It wasn't the penthouses or empires they could have claimed, but it was theirs. Together, they started a charity, using Avery's savings and James's business savvy to help kids from the streets. Kids like she'd been. Hope, they called it, the same word scratched on her old jar. Every smile they brought to a child's face felt like a victory, a piece of the past healed. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Avery sat on their porch, James beside her. She held his hand, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm. "I used to think love was a luxury I couldn't afford," she thought, watching the sky turn gold. "I spent so long fighting, proving I was enough. But with James, it's not about empires or revenge. It's about the quiet moments, like his hand in mine, promising forever. This is what I was waiting for, all those years ago." She turned to him, her voice soft. "You know, I never stopped believing in that promise, even when I didn't know it was you." James squeezed her hand, his eyes warm. "I never stopped looking, even when I thought I'd lost you." He pulled her close, his breath warm against her hair. "We don't need the world, Avery. We've got each other." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "That's all I ever wanted." The city hummed in the distance, but here, it was just them, two hearts stitched together by fate and a lollipop from a rainy day. Their days settled into a rhythm, simple and sweet. James traded his suits for jeans, learned to ride her old electric bike. One afternoon, he insisted on picking her up from a delivery shift. She climbed on behind him, laughing as he wobbled down the street. "You're terrible at this," she teased, her arms tight around his waist. "I'll get better," he shot back, grinning. "I've got the best teacher." They rode through New York, the wind in their hair, the past fading behind them like a shadow in the sun. Avery didn't wear the apex ring anymore. It sat in a drawer, a relic of a life she'd outgrown. She didn't need it to feel strong. James gave her that, not with money or power, but with the way he looked at her, like she was his whole world. "You're my hero," he said one night, lying beside her in their small bed. "You saved me then, and you save me every day." She smiled, brushing his hair back. "You saved me too. From myself." Their story wasn't loud or grand, not the kind that filled headlines or boardrooms. It was quiet, woven into stolen glances and shared silences, into the way he made her coffee just right, the way she tucked a blanket over him when he fell asleep on the couch. It was love, real and unshakable, built on a promise kept across years and scars. Fate brought us here, Avery thought, watching him sleep one night, the lollipop wrapper framed on their and I'd wait 1,000 years more if it meant finding him again. As spring bloomed, they planted flowers in their garden, hands sturdy and hearts light. James looked at her, mud on his cheek, and said, "This is it, isn't it? Our forever." Avery nodded, her smile wide. "Yeah," she said, "our forever." And in that moment, with the city alive beyond their little haven, they knew they'd found what they'd been searching for all along: each other.